Kenya's political rivals finally reach a coalition deal after weeks of violence and bitter negotiations. But can the feuding parties really work together? And what does the future hold? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Lauren Taylor. The former UN head Kofi Annan announced on Thursday that an agreement had been reached between Kenya's wrangling parties. Shortly after, Kenya's President Mwai Kibaki and opposition leader Raila Odinga signed the deal to end the post-election crisis.
There will be a post of Prime Minister of the Government of Kenya with authority to coordinate and supervise the execution of the functions and affairs of the Government of Kenya. The Prime Minister will be an elected member of Parliament and the parliamentary leader of the largest party in the National Assembly.
The creation of the Executive Prime Minister's post with powers to run the government seems a compromise good enough for the survival of Kenya, satisfying both rivals, and it's hoped the deal will put the brakes on any further violence in the country. Annan also said that more talks are underway for long-term reforms, including constitutional amendments. Kofi Annan has been mediating for the last 5 weeks. Since the election 2 months ago, more than 1,500 people have been killed and hundreds of thousands displaced. Well, after signing the agreement, both Kenyan politicians acknowledged there was more work to be done.
We have been reminded that we must do all in our power to safeguard our peace. That is the foundation of our national unity, social cohesion, economic growth, and political stability. Kenya has room for all of us if we can enhance peace and tolerance.
With the signing of this agreement, we have opened a new chapter in our country's history. From the era of face of confrontation to the beginning of cooperation. We on our side are completely committed to ensuring that this agreement will succeed. The ball has moved partially from the hands of the negotiators and ourselves to the Court of Parliament. It is going to be now the responsibility of a national parliament to ensure that the various legislation that are called for in this agreement are enacted as quickly as possible so that we can begin the task once again of nation building.
Well, joining our discussion are our guests. In New York, Salim Lone, spokesman of the Orange Democratic Party. In Johannesburg, Professor Peter KAGWANJA, founder and president of the Africa Policy Institute. And in London, Richard Dowden, director of the Royal African Society. But before talking to our guests, let's go to our correspondent in Nairobi, Yvonne Ndege. Yvonne, an historic agreement here. Will it satisfy the supporters on both sides?
Well, Lauren, the Orange Democratic Movement supporters will be absolutely ecstatic at this arrangement. From day one, since President Kibaki was sworn in, there have been acts of violence and they have been extremely unhappy with the outcome of the election. They believe firmly that Raila Odinga did win the presidential election and they will get some satisfaction from this. Their man will actually have power and we understand, of course, that Raila Odinga will, of course, share that power with Kibaki. Of course, the detail of that is what is emerging this evening.
And what do you think forced the breakthrough in the end?
The patience of Kofi Annan. Bear in mind, Lauren, that 48 hours ago, Kofi Annan was going to quit these talks. He'd given up virtually talking to representatives of President Kibaki. Kibaki had put forward the foreign minister and the Kenyan justice minister to negotiate on his behalf. And the ODM had various people negotiating on their behalf. He decided to bypass them and go and talk directly to President Kibaki and the opposition leader, Raila Odinga. Of course, Lauren, there's been huge international pressure over the last 4 to to 5 weeks. We've had a string of international top-class diplomats, if you like. The US Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, Jendai Fraser, was the first person to wade into this row, followed by John Kufuor, the head of the African Union. And then, of course, President Bush dispatched Condoleezza Rice to try and negotiate. She did manage to get the parties to agree to some kind of power-sharing arrangement. But, of course, at that time, what was unclear was precisely what they would agree to. Of course, today we have the detail of this agreement.
And now it has to go to Parliament. How quickly will all the next steps happen?
Well, President Kibaki said today that on the 6th of March, Parliament will be recalled. Bear in mind that after MPs are sworn in here in Kenya, they receive, quite controversially, I might add, a 6-week recess, a 6-week break. They'll now be recalled to Parliament on March the 6th to now enshrine this agreement. And let me just go over some of that detail. Of course, we know that Raila Odinga will become Prime Minister of Kenya with executive powers. And what that means in simple is that he will be leading government. He will have key powers in determining who forms the cabinet and what sort of business is actually conducted. Of course, the parliamentarians, there are 210 of them elected by the people of Kenya, will have to agree to these reforms. There is the potential, Lauren, in a country like Kenya for MPs to be extremely unhappy with this settlement, and there will be those who feel that President Kibaki has simply conceded too much ground. Bear in mind that more than 3 million people went out to vote for Kibaki, and they will call this a travesty of democracy. But the MPs are likely to agree to some kind of settlement simply to bring and restore peace and stability to Kenya. Lauren.
Yvonne, thanks very much indeed. Yvonne Ndege reporting for us from Nairobi. Well, let's bring in Professor Peter KAGWANJA now. Kofi Annan praised Mr Kibaki and Raila Odinga for their leadership and determination. How do you think that the power dynamic will work between those two in practice?
I think the power dynamic, the two have worked before together. So apart from the fact that they had this dispute of election, they have a background of how to work with each other as leaders. But then in this particular case, what has come to the fore is that the drafters of this agreement were very, very clear that they don't replicate Congo and Lumumba in 1960s, where we have two centers of power which cannot with no internal checks and balances. You'll notice that the president has retained much of the powers which he had. At the same time, the prime minister has enormous powers but subordinated to the parliament. And therefore, even though we have this divided executive between the president and the prime minister, the checks are very clear in this particular case, and one doesn't see the threat inherent there. But what the question is, how sustainable and how long this dispensation is going to take? Because it is up to now a transient order. Kenya needs an opposition at some stage, but I think under the circumstances, Kenya can only celebrate what has happened.
OK, Richard Dowden, if I could bring you in. Coalition governments are known for being unstable. Can this one last, do you think?
I think that the bad blood between those two men, it goes back quite a long way. I hear what Professor KAGWANJA says, but in 2002, this was almost exactly the deal that we've got now, is the one that was actually agreed before the 2002 election. And when they won that election, President Kibaki reneged on it and didn't appoint Raila Odinga as Prime Minister. So there is a lot of bad blood between them. But the fact that I think the most interesting thing here is that the proportion of the cabinet rests on parliamentary strength. And Raila Odinga has something like 111 MPs to Kibaki's 42. So this, if it follows that pattern, the cabinet is going to be massively a ODM cabinet.
And do you think that would, I mean, what do you think the effect of that would be in practice?
Well, when the agreement says that the Prime Minister will have the authority to coordinate and supervise the execution of the functions and affairs of the government of Kenya, I wonder exactly what is left to the president and whether what we're looking at is a almost symbolic presidency and a government that's actually run by the Prime Minister and the cabinet.
Professor KAGWANJA, is that your interpretation, that we'd end up with a symbolic role for the president?
I understand where Salim is coming from, but my understanding is that the imperial presidency that we inherited from the Lancaster House Conference is intact. The president is still the head of state. He's the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and he controls much of it. But what we are seeing here is Kenyans coming to the logic and thinking straight about their country, about their future, and saying what we need is to begin whittling down those powers of the presidency and putting some of them to somebody else who is now supervised by the legislature, which is parliament. Remember, if the president is unhappy with the government, he can dissolve parliament, and the agreement simply says that if parliament is dissolved, the prime minister is no more. And so in a sense, there is a need, there's a good balance here that safeguards the integrity of the country and at the same time reduces the power of the imperial presidency. And my only question is how this can be made sustainable on a long-term basis, because opposition in a democratic process is necessary.
Okay, if I could bring in Salim Alone in New York. There was talk in the speeches after the signing of opening a new chapter in the country's history, and Raila Odinga said we need to destroy the monster that we call ethnicity. Do you think this power-sharing deal will be able to destroy that monster, as he puts it?
Well, it will certainly make a beginning, because remember, nothing less than survival of Kenya as a unitary state was at stake here. Numerous people, including John Holmes, the Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs at the UN, who just visited Kenya, said that the nation risks being torn into two along ethnic lines. So I think all of us, from both sides, will need to recognize that while the aggrieved party in the election was ODM, both sides have suffered enormously. People who lived next to each other for generations had turned and killed their neighbors on both sides. So there is very strong sort of ethnic fear and hatred among some people at this time, and we must address that. And I think the only way to address this is to acknowledge that both sides suffered terribly. Innocent people were murdered, massacred in some cases, and I believe it is possible. Because remember, Kenya is not an ethnic-based society. We have had peace in the country for all these 40 years, 45 years. When there was ethnic violence, it was before elections and engineered by the regime. So in 2002, for example, when we had two Kikuyus running for president, no Kenyan complained. Kenyans were very happy, even though two Kikuyus were running for president, knowing that one of them was bound to be elected. The whole country united. And Raila Odinga supported Kibaki, while William Ruto supported Uhuru Kenyatta. So I believe that it is certainly possible, with good work from both sides, with less confrontation, to heal the wounds and to return to what we have always had, a stable, peace-loving society which has never been at war like it was this time.
Richard Dowden, could I bring you in? What's your view? Is that something that's achievable in the short term? Well, and the long term, I suppose.
Well, it has to be, because, as Salim says, it is the future of Kenya, not just Kenya, but the whole of East Africa. We're talking about 100 million people affected by this, because Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, Eastern Congo, Southern Sudan, Somalia are all dependent on a functioning Kenya. So there is an awful lot at stake. But I would say this is a first step, just to bring people round the table, to get them into some sort of coalition. But the big job is then to tackle some of the issues that this failed election really revealed. The huge resentment over land ownership, the power of the presidency, which was agreed should be reduced at the constitution that was agreed by all parties in 2003. The judicial appointments, the fact they're just appointed by the president without any consultation. The electoral commission, which is now completely broken, has got to be reconstituted. And I think one of the top things will be to finally bring to justice some of the people who stole an awful lot of money, not only in the recent regime, but in the previous ones as well. I mean, we're talking hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars stolen from the Kenyan people. And we know who they are. It's been revealed in commissions of inquiry. Nobody has ever yet been prosecuted for it.
Professor KAGWANJA, some of the issues that were mentioned there by Richard Dowden were also mentioned by Kofi Annan when he said that work now needs to start on the long-term matters. He mentioned poverty and inequality, land reform. Just on the land reform, for instance, alone, what needs to happen and how quickly can it happen to make a difference?
I think the first point is that is for Kenyans to go back to the drawing board. We all agreed at the beginning of our independence that we are citizens of the Republic of Kenya. So the first thing is to reassert the principle of civic citizenship, where you belong to Kenya and you can be anywhere in the part of the Republic of Kenya. And that will deal a death blow to the idea of ethnic cleansing in the terms of claiming that you have to belong to that part and therefore you have to live there. The second thing is to begin streamlining our land system. For example, there are some people who don't have land. There are others who have lost, who by virtue of being from weak communities have not been able to access resources. Remember, the importance of land in our country is because we have no alternative means of income. So as fast as we grow our economy, diversify and hopefully become industrial, then we'll ease the tension of land and become less dependent on our agrarian system of production. That will take time. It will need support from our international partners. It will need Kenyans to work together, and it will need transparent Kenyans who don't steal from the national coffer, from the little money that Kenyans are making. So a transparent society is integral to this process.
Salim Lone, what do you think? Is poverty and inequality something that this kind of a coalition government is capable of addressing?
Well, it'll be hard, and I don't want to play the ODM role here, but our manifesto, if you look at it, addressed all these long simmering problems that Kenya has faced for the last 40 years. Indeed, one of the reasons why so many Kenyans were enraged by the theft of the election, I mean, an election theft is something we are enraged about, but the intensity of their rage was in part due to the fact that they thought after 40 years, ODM finally is going to bring change and address all these issues like devolution of power, like land, like the extreme inequality. You know, we are one of the most unequal nations in the world. So I do believe there's a commitment to address that. It will not be easy. As Richard was saying, it will not be easy. There are many, many issues to be dealt with. But I am convinced that the long-term issues, because Kenyans are ready for change, will be addressed if there is cooperation on both sides. Obviously, cooperation is essential.
Okay, Richard Dowden, I just want to come back to a point that you made earlier about the whole region being dependent on a functioning Kenya, as you put it. Can you explain why that is? I mean, why does it have such a pivotal role in Africa?
The port of Mombasa on the Indian Ocean serves not just Kenya, but everything that it goes in or out of Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, Eastern Congo, and now South Sudan has to come through Congo. When this problem started, a lot of ships then had to go further south to Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, and there they found that the cost was 20% more. There were huge delays, and those other countries, I think the Burundians were saying they're losing $3 million a month in tax just from the loss of the transport network. Some places are even worse. There are fuel shortages. The price of fuel has gone rocketing up in Uganda. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence that just this month of mayhem in Kenya has already caused huge economic problems for the region.
Professor KAGWANJA, just on that issue, do you think that was partly why the international community was prepared to make the kind of threats it was making in the last few days through Condoleezza Rice, that if a solution wasn't found, the international community would intervene?
I think Kenya is very central to not just to Eastern Africa, but to the entire of Africa, and therefore the stability of Kenya as a country signifies basically the forward progress of democracy, the economic well-being of the continent of Africa, and that optimism. And therefore, you can understand why the international community came in heavily to support a mediated deal. And unlike other protracted deals in Africa, this has a record time, and in terms of its result, it's earth-shaking. I mean, it is really fundamental. What one is trying to say here is that Kenya still remains very pivotal to geopolitics of the global geopolitics, whether we are talking about America's interest, the Indian Ocean, whether we are talking about the economic, global economic system, I mean, it's really central. If not substantially, even symbolically, it's a very important country.
Salim Lone, Kofi Annan said that Kenya is effectively the moral inspiration and engine for growth, or it needs to be. Would you agree with that view?
Oh, without any question, historically that's been the case. There has been some, other countries have been coming up and doing very well, as in Tanzania. But I think I would just want to build on what Peter said, Kenya's centrality to Africa as a whole. And I think one of the great outcomes, one of the great consequences of this outcome is that Africa will recognize now that elections cannot be stolen. If this election outcome had been allowed to stand, it would have sent a terrible message to the world, and to Africa in particular, that if it can happen in Kenya, why can it not happen elsewhere? So the world owes really an immense debt to Mr. Kofi Annan, because he came straight out of hospital. Literally, he was on intravenous feeding. He left Geneva in order to what I believe was his greatest challenge he'd ever faced. And he stuck to it, and I believe it was his mediation and the positions he took and what he advocated that allowed the international community to recognize what the issue was in Kenya, and therefore to bring the maximum pressure on the government. Even a day ago, I was on TV saying this government is not serious about negotiating because it is raising new roadblocks all the time. But clearly, the pressure worked, and we are all very, very happy that President Kibaki has taken this huge step, which, as Peter said earlier, his supporters will not like. But I should also say that many of our supporters will not like this agreement either, because they feel we won the election. Why should we not have Mr. Odinga as our president? Because he can bring change. So I think there have been compromises on both sides, and I do believe it will be very, very difficult, but I am hopeful, and a great debt to Mr. Kofi Annan.
Just briefly on that last point about the supporters, do you think that you can bring them on side and convince them that this deal is good for them?
Yes, I believe so. I mean, obviously there will be some, militant people who will not be happy. But I believe what they saw on television today, I mean, poor Raila was actually almost crying. He was so happy. This is a very wonderful day for Kenya. And I do believe all supporters can be brought on board, or most supporters will be brought on board. And if few are left, there will not be a problem.
Richard Dowden, it was quite an emotional moment, and it's quite nice to see some sort of positive news for once, isn't it? How do you think this will hold?
Well, it is wonderful. It's wonderful that it's happened. I hope it'll hold. But the other thing that I keep thinking is that why wasn't this done before in other African disputes? If you look at what happened in Kenya, the Kenyan government actually rejected a delegation of 4 African presidents, the President of the African Union, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Cyril Ramaphosa. They were all sent away with a flea in their ear. And it was only that immense international pressure where Kofi Annan was speaking as former Secretary General of the UN, but he was speaking for the UN, for the African Union, for the European Union, for the United States of America. There was no way out for the Kenyan government. They had no ally, and that was the way other African disputes in the past should have been dealt with, and they weren't. People walked away and let people fight. And I think this is, I mean, it's a little sad note to add to the end of this, but why couldn't this have been done in so many the beginnings of other African wars, which have cost thousands of lives? Why wasn't this done before?
Richard Dowden, you have the last word there, because unfortunately on this interesting subject we've run out of time. But thank you to all the guests. In New York, Salim Lone, spokesman of the Orange Democratic Party. In Johannesburg, Professor Peter KAGWANJA, founder and president of the Africa Policy Institute. And in London, Richard Dowden, director of the Royal African Society. Thank you all. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We always welcome your comments and suggestions. Email them to us, insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye for now.